The boots echoed on the barn floor, sharp against the silence. The Japanese comfort girls, what remained of them, stood frozen as the cowboy tipped his hat and said, "Queue up, girls." Their bodies tensed. Back in Japan, that phrase came before the worst, before pain, before shame. But this wasn't Japan. This was Texas. They obeyed. One by one they stepped forward, not knowing what awaited. A row of chairs, a cotton sheet hung for privacy, a line of cowboys standing beside, a table filled with brushes, combs, basins of hot water, and bottles of something that shimmered in the sunlight. Shampoo. The girls looked at one another, confusion widening in their eyes. A cowboy crouched beside the first girl, dipped the comb in water, and gently parted her tangled hair. No leering, no commands, just quiet care. One whispered in Japanese, "They are washing us like sisters." In that moment, the war cracked, not with violence, but with soap and gentleness. The girls stood in a hesitant line, their shoulders rigid, their eyes narrowed to slits of instinctive suspicion. "Queue up, girls," the cowboy had said again, softer this time, almost like he was speaking to his own nieces. But those words, "queue up," were not soft in their ears. Back home, they had signaled pain. They had meant, stand straight, be silent, wait for whatever was coming next. So they queued. Not because they trusted, but because that's what the body did when the mind shut down. The line moved slowly. In front, a girl named Emmy flinched when her turn came. A chair was pulled out. A basin of steaming water sat on the table. One cowboy rolled up his sleeves and dipped a comb into the water as if preparing to groom a prized horse. But this was no animal. This was a girl trained to disappear. When Emmy sat, her knees trembled so visibly the cowboy placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, not to restrain, but to steady. He didn't speak. None of them did. They'd been told not to touch, not unless necessary, so they didn't. But their silence wasn't empty. It was deliberate, respectful, almost sacred. The brush slid through Emmy's hair with slow, practiced strokes. Every pass brought with it strands of dust, oil, old sweat, the war, leaving her scalp one stroke at a time. Her eyes welled, but she said nothing. She didn't understand the language. She didn't need to. The warmth of the water, the rhythm of the brushing, the absence of cruelty. It all spoke louder than words. Behind her, the other girls watched in disbelief. Ayako, the second in line, kept glancing toward the barn door, expecting a sudden shout, a reversal. Surely this was a trick. Surely the kindness would turn. Her nails bit into her palm as she stepped forward. When the cowboy offered her a small towel, she froze. He didn't insist. He simply left it on the table and turned his back, letting her make the choice. She took it, quickly, almost guiltily. A basin was brought before her. This time she dipped her own fingers in. The water was hot and smelled faintly of something floral. Not perfume, something humbler. She didn't have a word for it, but it reminded her of her mother's hands after washing clothes in the river years ago. There was no laughter from the men, no smirking. One cowboy, young, maybe no older than the girls themselves, kept his gaze lowered the entire time. He wiped his hands on a cloth again and again, as if he were the one trying to wash something away. Another adjusted the curtain hanging behind the chairs, giving the girls a semblance of privacy. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't cruel. And that, in itself, was more confusing than anything they'd prepared for. By the time Haruka stepped forward, she was crying openly, not sobbing, but tears falling down her face without shame or explanation. When the comb caught on a tangle, the cowboy paused. She waited for the slap, the barked command. Instead, he gently worked the knot loose with his fingers. She inhaled sharply, as if struck, but the pain didn't come. And that absence of pain hurt more than anything else. Behind her, another girl whispered in Japanese, "Are we dreaming?" No one answered. The queue moved slowly, but no one rushed. Each girl emerged from the chair a little cleaner, a little quieter, their hair damp and combed, their shoulders slightly less rigid. They still looked like prisoners, but something had shifted. The silence in the barn wasn't fear anymore. It was bewilderment, reverent, as if something sacred had occurred and no one knew how to speak of it. They didn't trust the Cowboys. Not yet. But they didn't flinch anymore when one stepped close. And when the last girl in line was handed a clean towel, folded square, with a tiny embroidered corner, she held it like treasure. No one had ever folded anything for her before, and in the corner of her mouth, barely noticeable, a tremor of something almost forgotten began to form, the beginning of a smile. Before Texas, there was smoke, thick, black, and endless. It curled through the narrow alleys of Nagoya and Osaka, clung to the rafters of wooden homes, and settled in the creases of a girl's uniform like a second skin. The girls who now stood in line for warm water had once stood for something else, something darker. Back then, they had worn the khaki of Teishintai volunteers, though the word volunteer had little meaning. You didn't refuse a military official. You nodded, you bowed, you followed orders. That's how the war swallowed you, not in a roar, but in quiet obedience. Yuriko remembered the day the officer came. She was 15. Her mother had hidden in the kitchen, hands shaking too much to offer tea. Yuriko had stepped forward, her hair tied tight, her face blank. "For the Emperor," he said. "For honor." She nodded. What else could she do? A week later, she was sent to a field hospital near Manila. There, she learned how to smile on command, how to bite her tongue until it bled, how to disappear when the door opened. The comfort stations were rarely buildings. Often they were tents or basements, shadows made of canvas or cement. The girls slept in corners. When they cried, they did it into the pillow. When they bled, they were given rags. When they begged to stop, they were told to endure. Endurance was the only virtue left. They weren't allowed mirrors. Names were forgotten. They were Girl Number 3, or simply You. Even their handwriting, once practiced in calligraphy books back home, grew shaky, useless. What use was poetry when no one cared if you lived? And above it all, like a radio that never turned off, came the voice of propaganda. "Americans are beasts," the officers said. "They will not take you prisoner. They will not show mercy." Pamphlets were distributed showing drawings of American soldiers with animal faces. One girl named Keiko believed every word. Her brother had died in the Pacific. Her father had stopped speaking after Tokyo burned. She believed in revenge, until her first day at the station. Then belief turned to numbness. By the time the war began to collapse, the girls had stopped dreaming. The sirens didn't scare them anymore. The bombs were almost a relief. At least they meant change. It was during one of those raids that the orders came. Surrender. The Emperor himself had spoken, his voice crackling through a broken loudspeaker. "Endure the unendurable." Some girls thought it was a trick. Others wept because it wasn't. In the days that followed, the girls were gathered up, not by the enemy, but by their own, herded like livestock, loaded onto trucks without explanation. Then came the ships, rust-stained, groaning vessels that smelled of diesel and salt. They expected to be thrown into cargo holds. Instead, they were shown rows of bunks, given trays with bread, meat, water that didn't taste like rust. No one spoke to them, but no one beat them either. That silence was a new kind of disorientation. Miyako, who had not cried in over 2 years, stared at the bread in her hands until her fingers cramped. She didn't eat, not that day, not until she watched one of the others eat and not die. Only then did she taste it, and with it came a flood of guilt so strong she vomited behind a bulkhead. The sea stretched endlessly. The girls huddled below deck, saying little. A few murmured prayers, others stared at their knees. They did not know where they were going. America? It wasn't a country to them. It was a monster, a myth, a void. But the truth was, they were empty already. And when the Texas wind touched their skin for the first time, it didn't feel like arrival. It felt like exile from everything they had ever been told, because the war hadn't ended for them. It had only changed its face. The ship didn't smell like blood. That was the first impossibility. The girls, packed tightly in the lower deck, waited for the stench of sweat, of rot, of old pain. But instead, they smelled salt and iron and something oddly clean. They waited for the barked orders, the shove of boots, the fists behind clipped commands. But the men, American sailors with rolled sleeves and sunburnt necks, barely looked at them. When they did, it was with something that felt more like indifference than hatred, and somehow that stung worse. Hatred meant you were still a threat. Indifference meant you didn't matter. Each girl was handed a tray, no shouting, no slaps, just trays. On them, a boiled egg, a roll, a slice of orange. It was a meal more complete than anything they had eaten in months. Yuri held hers like it might explode. The egg steamed faintly in the cold air of the hold. She stared at it for what might have been 40 minutes, unmoving, as the others sat beside her in silence. She had once peeled an egg for her younger brother during a spring picnic before the war. The memory rose uninvited, bringing with it a sting behind her eyes that had nothing to do with hunger. When she finally ate, it wasn't out of trust. It was surrender of a different kind, to the possibility that something was wrong with the world she'd been built to believe in. The beds were stacked steel frames with canvas slings, no straw, no dirt floor, thin, scratchy blankets, but real ones, folded and waiting. They were told nothing, not where they were going, not why, not when. The girls still whispered in the dark, words clinging to the air like fog. One whispered, "They're fattening us for something." Another nodded, "They'll wait until we're clean, then they'll show their true faces." The belief had been hammered too deep to dislodge overnight. Even decency was seen as a trick, and yet each small gesture unraveled a thread. A medic, checking temperatures, handed back the thermometer with 2 hands. A gesture of respect in Japanese culture. He didn't know, but one girl noticed. Another was handed a cup of water, and the sailor looked away as she drank, not staring like the officers had back home. That privacy, so small, so meaningless to the man, struck like lightning through her spine. Still, their names were gone. Upon boarding, they were registered not as individuals, but as cargo. Tags were tied to their wrists with numbers. The Americans called them in English. 086, one said, motioning for a girl to follow. Her name was Kana, but no one called her that now. She didn't correct them. She couldn't. She didn't have the words anymore. Her language felt like a coat she'd outgrown. In that silence, she wrote her name in the condensation on a steel wall. It disappeared a moment later. The girls no longer spoke of going home. They no longer asked each other where they thought the ship was going. The ocean was endless, and time had no meaning below deck. What they did talk about, quietly, cautiously, was how none of them had been touched. Not a single shove, not a single slap, just nods. Orders, yes, but orders without venom. One girl said she'd been given a pencil. Another said a sailor had returned her dropped scarf. These weren't acts of affection, but they were proof of something even stranger. Restraint. The girls didn't understand it, and that was the beginning of the break. Not a loud one, a quiet, internal rupture. If the Americans weren't beasts, then what were they? And if kindness was possible, what else had been a lie? That question hovered like smoke, drifting through the hull, settling beneath their skin. No one said it aloud, but no one could stop feeling it, not even in sleep. The hum of the ship's engine gave way to something else. Open air, dry heat, and the sound of boots crunching on dirt. When the girls were led off the buses and into the Texas camp, they didn't see cages, they didn't hear shouting. There were no barking dogs, no towers manned with machine guns, only the long shadows of wooden barns, the wide sweep of barbed wire stretched lazily along a fence line, and the occasional snort of a horse from somewhere unseen. The sky arched high and empty above them, cloudless and too blue, like a ceiling scrubbed clean of history. The war had colored everything in ash and gray. This was color. This was wrong. A cowboy, that's what he looked like anyway, stepped forward and pointed toward the stalls. He said something in English none of them understood, but his tone was even, almost kind. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't touch them. One girl flinched anyway when he gestured, but he backed off, hands open. The girls shuffled into the barn with the gait of women who didn't trust floors. Inside, they found hay, soft, fresh, not matted with filth, stacked in corners with folded wool blankets placed neatly on top. Each girl hesitated before sitting, like the ground might bite them. Yuki was the first to sit down. She didn't lie down yet. She pressed her hand into the hay, then lifted it, testing for traps. When nothing happened, she took the blanket in both hands. It was coarse, but clean. It smelled faintly of starch. No blood, no mildew, just cotton and wool and something so normal it made her throat tighten. She wrapped it around her shoulders and stared at the wooden beams overhead. The ceiling didn't press down. It gave her space. She hated it. She didn't understand it, and she was terrified by how badly she wanted to believe it would last. That night, the girls lay in rows like uneasy cattle. No one spoke. A few cried softly into their blankets, not from fear, but from the weight of its absence. And then, just before midnight, someone began humming. It came from outside the barn, one of the guards, maybe a cowboy, maybe a soldier. A slow, low tune, something close to a lullaby. It drifted through the slats in the wall like smoke. The girls didn't move. They kept their eyes shut. But their ears strained toward it as if it might anchor them in a reality they hadn't asked for. Back in the stations, the men who used them never sang. Back home, lullabies had stopped when the bombings began. This sound, simple, aimless humming, tore something inside them wider than any weapon could. Aya thought of the officer who had once slapped her for looking too long at her own reflection. He'd said mirrors made women selfish. The man outside the barn, whoever he was, had covered the horse trough with a canvas earlier that day so the girls wouldn't be embarrassed washing in view of the fence. He hadn't spoken, just covered it and walked away. That silence said more than speeches. The contrast was unbearable. Back home, power came with violence. Here it came with restraint. Some girls refused to eat the next morning, not out of protest, but paralysis. When a cowboy handed them a tin plate and walked away without watching them eat, it was too much. A few stared at the food until it went cold. One girl hid her bread in the hay. not because she thought it would be stolen, but because she didn't trust herself to finish it. Mercy was too strange. It had to be temporary, a mistake, a test. They didn't speak the word freedom. They didn't dare. But when they stepped into the sun the next morning and saw a horse rolling in the dirt beyond the wire, tail flicking lazily in the light, they felt something stir in their stomachs that wasn't hunger. It was fear of hope, and that, more than pain, was the thing they didn't know how to survive. Morning arrived without a siren. No whistle, no shouted command, just light slipping through the slats of the barn and settling on the girls' faces like a question. One by one they stirred beneath their blankets, hands instinctively clutching the wool as if it might be taken the moment they loosened their grip. But it wasn't. The blanket was still there, heavy, real, warm. For a long moment, several of them simply sat up and stared at it as if daring it to vanish. Later that morning, they were called forward again, gently this time, with gestures instead of barked orders. On a wooden table near the fence lay small, ordinary objects arranged with deliberate care. Bars of soap, pale and clean, their edges still sharp. Toothbrushes wrapped in thin paper. A stack of folded cloth name tags. One by one, the girls stepped forward. Each was handed a bundle, no explanation, no ceremony, just the quiet transfer of something meant to belong to them. When Aiko saw her name written in careful block letters, A-I-K-O, her breath caught. It was her name. Not a number, not a rank, not girl. She turned the tag over twice, as if expecting another label beneath it. There wasn't one. Her fingers trembled as she pinned it to her shirt. The fabric felt heavier afterward, like it carried weight beyond cotton. Across the yard, another girl pressed her tag to her chest and bowed her head, eyes closed, lips moving in a silent apology. To whom, she didn't know. The soap was the hardest. Its smell alone was enough to make Yumi dizzy, clean, floral, not the harsh sting of disinfectant or the sour reek of old water. She held it with both hands, unsure how to grip something so intact. Back in the stations, soap had been rationed or withheld. Cleanliness was a privilege. Here it was given without comment. When she finally washed her hands at the trough, now shielded by canvas again, the lather bloomed white against her skin, erasing grime she hadn't realized she still carried. She scrubbed until her knuckles ached, not because she was dirty, but because stopping felt like admitting this was real. Around them, the cowboys moved quietly. One knelt to show a girl how to brush tangles from the ends of her hair without pulling. Another held open a gate while a pair of girls were led toward a small chicken pen. "Feed," he said, tapping the bucket gently, then stepping back. The girls exchanged glances. Care for life? That had never been asked of them before. Their hands shook as they scattered grain, watching the birds peck and cluck, alive and unconcerned. Something in that simple rhythm, give, wait, watch, began to stitch a torn place inside them. At night, the blankets came back into their arms. The girls wrapped themselves tighter, some even sleeping sitting up, afraid the ground would betray them if they lay down fully. One whispered, "If I sleep, it will end." Another answered, "If you don't, you'll never know if it was real." No one knew which was worse. The guilt came later. It arrived quietly, creeping in with the warmth, with the full stomachs, with the way their skin no longer crawled from grime and neglect. Aya stared at her clean hands and thought of her sister back home, likely still washing in cold water, if she was alive at all. Keiko hid her toothbrush beneath the hay, ashamed to be seen using it. Comfort felt like theft, like betrayal. each kindness pressed against the memory of suffering left behind, and yet the body responded anyway. Shoulders loosened, breaths deepened. One girl laughed suddenly while brushing her hair, startled by the sound as if it had come from someone else. The others froze, waiting for punishment that never came. The laugh faded into embarrassed silence. But it had existed. That was enough to frighten them. The blanket became a boundary, not between them and the cowboys, but between who they had been and who they might become. At night, fingers traced its rough weave, memorizing the feel, afraid that forgetting would mean losing it. It wasn't just warmth, it was proof that someone, somewhere, believed their bodies were worth protecting. For women taught they were expendable. That realization was unbearable, because once you are treated like a person, you must face the question that follows. Why weren't you before? The next morning, the smell hit first. It drifted across the open yard long before any of the girls opened their eyes. Thick, savory, curling like smoke, but sweeter, heavier. For a moment, they were back in the bunkers, lungs tight, prepared for alarms. But when eyes opened and hearts steadied, they saw it was something else, something cooking. The sound followed, that sharp, steady crackle, bacon sizzling. The cowboys didn't make an announcement. They just gathered around the cast-iron pans like it was any ordinary morning. But for the girls, it wasn't ordinary. Food had never been a gesture of care. It had been weapon, ration, punishment. Here, though, plates were handed out, not thrown. Spoons set down, not slammed. No barking, no counting. Just a quiet rhythm of breakfast in the making. At first, no one moved. Then, slowly, Aiko approached. A plate was passed to her. 2 eggs, 1 slice of bread, and a thick strip of bacon still gleaming with grease. She held it like it might explode. She sat down on the edge of a bench, away from the men, and stared at it. Others followed cautiously, plates clutched tight, knees bent low, spines stiff with memory. Yumi sat beside Aiko, her fingers trembling. She stared at the bacon for a long time before she touched it. "My father," she whispered. "He used to eat this on payday. It was a luxury." Then she picked it up, took 1 bite, and gagged. Not from the taste, from the memory, from the unfairness of having it now when he couldn't. She doubled over, crying softly into her sleeve. No one said anything, but one cowboy standing nearby knelt down slowly and placed a cup of warm milk on the ground beside her. He didn't touch her, didn't speak, just stood back up and returned to the fire. She would drink it an hour later, when her hands stopped shaking, and then someone laughed. It was soft at first, a chuckle, a breath caught between disbelief and delight. One of the younger girls had dropped her bread, and a chicken had made a beeline for it. She'd chased the bird on instinct, slipping in the hay, arms flailing. It was ridiculous, and it was funny. The laugh came out raw, surprised, uncontrollable. Others froze, but the cowboys laughed too, not at her, but with her. It wasn't mocking, it was release. That moment broke something open, not all at once, but the edges softened. By the end of the week, the girls were sitting closer to the fire, still quiet, still watchful, but accepting seconds when offered, chewing slower, savoring more. Not because they trusted, but because hunger and grief don't always wait for permission. The cowboys never asked them to talk. They never asked what had been done to them. They just cooked, ate, shared the warmth. And that, more than any interrogation or apology, was what undid the silence. A shared meal is an equalizer. And in that strange place, Where nothing made sense and kindness was terrifying, the simple act of eating together became its own kind of language. The girls didn't need to speak English to understand the offering. They saw it in the way plates were handed with two hands, in the way no one reached first, but waited for them, in the way laughter wasn't punished, trust didn't come in a flood. It crept in like dawn, a little more light each day, a little less fear in the breath, a small smile returned over a shoulder. A quiet "thank you" whispered in Japanese that no one else understood, but somehow still felt. And maybe the most frightening part was this: they started to feel hungry again, not just for food, but for life, for something that didn't hurt. Night settled over the ranch without warning, the Texas sky darkening in a slow, deliberate way that felt almost respectful. The girls lay beneath their blankets, eyes closed, breaths shallow, listening to the sounds they were still learning to trust. Crickets, wind through dry grass, the distant shuffle of boots, changing shifts. No shouting, no alarms, just space, and then music. At first it was so faint they thought it was memory. A single note, thin and uncertain, drifting through the open barn door. Then another, and another. Someone was playing a piano. The instrument had been dragged into the far barn weeks earlier, its wood scuffed, one leg shorter than the others. It had belonged to a rancher's wife before the war. No one had touched it since. But now, a cowboy sat alone on the bench, hat set on the floor, fingers moving carefully over the keys as if afraid to wake something fragile. The melody was simple, not a march, not a hymn, just a tune that wandered, searching for somewhere to rest. The girls did not move. They had learned that stillness was safety. They lay with their faces turned toward the hay, pretending sleep, but every ear strained. The notes slipped under the blankets and into their chests, filling spaces they hadn't known were empty. One girl, Hannah, pressed her lips together as the melody pulled a sound from deep in her throat. A hum, soft, almost nothing. She startled herself and stopped, heart racing. No punishment came. The music continued. Across the barn, Aiko sat up slowly and reached for the scrap of paper she'd hidden beneath her bedding. It had once been a supply tag, discarded near the fence. With the stub of a pencil given weeks earlier, she began to draw. Her hand shook at first, unused to choosing what to make. Then lines formed. Petals, a stem, a flower she hadn't seen since she was a child. Camellia, growing behind her grandmother's house. She didn't know why she drew it. She only knew she had to. Music did that. It made room. The piano played on, sometimes stumbling, sometimes strong. The cowboy paused once, rubbed his hands together for warmth, then resumed. The girls learned his name later, Thomas, but that night he was just sound. Breath turned into melody. Something made by a human, not to command or threaten, but simply to exist. For women whose lives had been measured in minutes and orders, this was dangerous. Beauty without purpose was forbidden back home. Art was indulgence. Music was propaganda or prayer. Never comfort, never personal. And yet, here it was, floating freely, asking nothing in return. By the third night, the girls no longer pretended to sleep. They sat with their blankets wrapped tight, backs against the barn wall, watching shadows move as Thomas played. No one told them to stop. One girl closed her eyes and imagined she was somewhere else, not Japan, not Texas, just a place where sound could exist without fear. Small changes followed. Someone began to hum during chores. Another girl traced patterns in the dirt with a stick while feeding the chickens. Words returned slowly, first in whispers, then in half-formed thoughts. One girl wrote her name again, this time on paper. Another practiced writing English letters she'd seen on a crate. The letters looked wrong, clumsy, but they were hers. They didn't talk about the music. Not directly, but when it played, shoulders lowered, breathing slowed. The body remembered what it felt like to exist without bracing for impact. That was the true danger. Not that they would forget the war, but that they would remember themselves. One night, as the final notes faded, the barn was silent. No applause, no words, just a shared stillness heavy with things unsaid. Thomas stood, picked up his hat, and left without looking back. The girls remained seated long after the door closed. Yumi pressed her hand to her chest and felt something unfamiliar there. Not fear, not hunger. Something gentler, something unfinished. For years, survival had been the only goal. Wake up, endure, repeat. But now, beneath a Texas sky, with music still echoing in their bones, another thought surfaced. Quiet, terrifying, and full of possibility. What if they were more than what had been done to them? What if they were still someone? The permission came quietly, almost carelessly, which somehow made it heavier. A cowboy set a small stack of paper on the table near the fence. Beside it, a tin cup filled with pencils worn down to blunt stubs. He tapped the paper once, then pointed toward the barracks and said a single word slowly, as if testing it in his mouth. "Right." Then he walked away. For a long moment no one moved. Writing home had been forbidden. Letters were censored, destroyed, or twisted into evidence. Words had been dangerous once. Words could betray you, your family, your unit. Words could be used to punish. The girls stared at the paper as if it were another test. Some backed away. Others folded their arms tightly, afraid that touching it would make something irreversible happen. Aiko was the first to step forward. She picked up a sheet, held it between both hands, and felt how thin it was, how fragile. She sat on the edge of a crate, pencil hovering above the page, heart pounding harder than it ever had during inspections. What could she say? That she was alive? That felt like a lie. Parts of her were still buried in smoke and silence. That she was treated kindly? That felt like betrayal. That the enemy fed her bacon and brushed her hair and played piano at night? No one back home would believe that. Maybe she didn't believe it herself. Around her, others reacted in their own ways. One girl burst into tears the moment she touched the paper, sobbing into it as if it were already a letter, soaked through with grief. Another stared at the blank page until her hands shook, then set it down untouched, unable to begin. Writing meant remembering. Writing meant choosing truth over survival. Aiko lowered the pencil and wrote her name at the top. Slowly, carefully, each letter deliberate. She hadn't written it in years. Seeing it there, whole, unbroken, made her chest ache. Below it, she paused again. The silence around her was thick, reverent. No guards hovered. No one watched over shoulders. The act was hers alone. She wrote one sentence. "I am safe." Nothing more. The words looked small, inadequate, almost childish. But they were true, and that truth, simple as it was, felt like rebellion. Others followed. Yumi wrote about the food, then crossed it out. She wrote about the blankets, then crossed that out too. Finally, she wrote, "They do not hurt us." Her hand shook as she underlined it twice. Hana drew a small flower at the bottom of her page instead of words. Afraid language would fail her. Keiko wrote a letter meant for no one. A confession of things she had never said aloud, folded and hidden beneath her mattress. The paper absorbed more than ink. It took grief, guilt, relief, and confusion all at once. Writing didn't erase the past. It gave it shape. It turned noise into something that could be held. They were told the letters might never leave the camp, that they could be delayed, rid, stopped. No promises were made. Strangely, that made it easier. The girls were not writing to be heard. They were writing to remember who they were before survival had stripped them bare. That afternoon, the camp felt different. No visible change, same fences, same routines, but inside the women, something had shifted. A belief they hadn't named had begun to crack. If the enemy allowed words, if they allowed truth, then maybe the world was not as simple as they'd been taught. Maybe cruelty wasn't inevitable. Maybe dignity could exist without permission from an empire. None of them spoke about it. Revolutions don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they arrive quietly, in pencil marks and folded paper, in the dangerous act of admitting, even privately, that you are alive. That night, the girls tucked their letters away, some beneath blankets, some inside shoes, some pressed flat against their hearts. Whether the letters were ever sent no longer mattered. The writing had already done its work. Because once you put words to paper, you can't pretend you are nothing. Are you finding this story as powerful as we do? If so, please like the video and drop a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. That morning, Aiko didn't eat. She sat beneath the old pecan tree just outside the barn, knees tucked to her chest, her blanket wrapped loosely around her shoulders, even though the Texas sun was already climbing. She stared at the dry dirt, eyes distant, almost glassy. When one of the younger girls approached with a piece of cornbread and offered it silently, Aiko looked up and whispered a question that cracked the world open for all of them. If the Americans are not monsters, then what were we taught? The cornbread remained untouched between them. No one had an answer, not even the guards who overheard the whisper and walked away slowly, their boots leaving deep tracks in the earth. The question festered. It wasn't just about the Americans anymore. It was about the girls themselves, what they'd believed, what they'd done. What had been done to them. The Emperor's war had painted everything in absolutes, glory or shame, victory or death, honor or erasure. There had been no room for doubt. But now, there was room for everything, for doubt, for confusion, for grief. Especially grief. That night, Aiko couldn't sleep. She stared at the rafters of the hayloft and thought of her first assignment back in the Philippines. She had been 17, a soldier from Hokkaido, his hands shaking, her own body trembling. She had thought then that the war would end if she simply obeyed enough, smiled enough, sacrificed enough. But it hadn't ended. It had devoured her. Now, here in Texas, she was being given her name back. A toothbrush, a blanket, letters, music, even laughter, and none of it made sense. None of it felt fair, because the truth was, kindness hurt more than cruelty. Cruelty had rules. You learned them fast. You numbed the skin. You shut down the heart. You focused on breathing and obedience. But kindness? Kindness opened things, tore through armor, left you bare. One girl confessed in a whisper that she hated the sound of laughter now, not because it reminded her of what she lacked, but because it made her remember her younger brother. His laugh, how she used to join him, before the trains, before the stations, before she learned to lock her smile away like a dangerous thing. Another girl, Yumi, began tying her hair with a ribbon again, a simple act, done without thinking. But when she saw herself in the reflection of a metal water bucket, she froze. She didn't look like a comfort girl anymore. She looked like someone's daughter. And the guilt of that nearly broke her. But even in guilt, something else was beginning to grow. One morning, a few of them started helping the cook prepare breakfast without being asked. Another stitched a hole in a cowboy's shirt, her fingers trembling but precise. Someone swept the barn, humming the lullaby the guard had played days before. And when a cowboy tipped his hat and said, "Thank you," one girl, just one, looked up and said, "You're welcome," in broken English. Her voice cracked on the words, but she said them. They were choosing dignity, not as a reward, not as a gift, but as a reclamation. The war had tried to define them by use. Here, in this camp wrapped in barbed wire and soft Texas wind, they were beginning to define themselves by something else, by how they treated each other, how they held their own pain gently, how they dared to dream of lives beyond numbers, beyond orders, beyond the empire that had once told them obedience was the only virtue. Their old beliefs didn't shatter overnight, but they cracked. And through those cracks, light came in. And maybe that was the most terrifying thing of all, because if their enemy had not been a monster, then what did that make them? The question would not be answered. Not yet. But for the first time, they were brave enough to ask it out loud. Repatriation did not arrive with celebration. It came the way everything else had in this strange place. Quietly, almost apologetically. A notice was read in English, then repeated slowly, haltingly, by a translator whose voice shook. The girls stood in a loose line, clutching blankets, letters, small bundles of belongings that had somehow become precious. They listened without fully understanding the words, but they understood the meaning. They were leaving. The days that followed were filled with small, careful rituals, medical checks, new coats issued, heavier than the ones they'd arrived with, their seams still stiff, their smell clean and unfamiliar. The doctor weighed each girl, scribbling notes, nodding in quiet approval. Cheeks that had once been sunken now held color. Arms that had been little more than bone had softened. Eyes that once stared through everything now lingered, curious, alert. They still carried scars, but they no longer looked like ghosts. Aiko folded her letter one last time and tucked it into the sleeve of her coat, close to her wrist. She had never mailed it. She wasn't sure she ever would. It was enough that it existed, enough that she had written the words. Nearby, Yumi adjusted a pink ribbon in her hair, a gift from a cowboy's daughter who had come to the fence one afternoon, curious and shy. The girl hadn't spoken. She had simply held out the ribbon and smiled. Yumi had bowed, tears slipping down her cheeks as she tied it carefully, hands trembling. She wore it now, head held higher than she ever had before. On the morning of departure, the camp gathered near the gates. The trucks waited beyond the wire, engines idling. The cowboys stood in a loose line, hats in their hands. No one gave a speech. There were no photographs, just silence, thick, heavy, reverent. One by one the girls stepped forward. Some bowed, some nodded. One cried openly, pressing her face into her coat as she passed. A cowboy tipped his hat and whispered something soft she didn't understand, but she understood the tone. It was goodbye. When the trucks rolled toward the port, dust rising behind them, the girls watched the Texas land slip away. The barns, the fence, the place where something impossible had happened, where they had been fed, washed, named, seen. At the ship, they were told to line up. "Queue up, girls!" The words landed differently this time. Aiko felt them ripple through her body, not as a command, not as a threat, but as something almost gentle. Girls, not numbers. Not property, not shame. Girls. She stepped forward, boots steady on the gangplank, the ribbon in Yumi's hair catching the light behind her. For a brief moment, the old reflex surged. Straighten, silence, brace. Then it faded. She smiled, not wide, not careless, just enough. The ship horn sounded. Ropes were pulled free. As the shoreline began to recede, the girls gathered along the railing. No one waved at first. Then one hand lifted, then another. Some of the cowboys waved back. One wiped his eyes with the back of his sleeve and looked away quickly, embarrassed by the gesture. The ocean stretched ahead, endless and uncertain. Home waited on the other side, or something like it. They knew it would not be easy. They would return to a country broken by war, weighed down by silence and shame. They would not be welcomed as heroes. Some might not be welcomed at all, but they were returning changed, not healed, not whole, but awake. They carried questions now instead of slogans, memories instead of obedience, the knowledge that kindness could exist where cruelty had been promised, that dignity could survive even after everything else was stripped away. As the ship moved forward, Aiko reached into her sleeve and touched the folded paper there just to make sure it was still real. Then she looked out at the water, at the wide sky above it, and breathed deeply. She did not know who she would be when she returned, but she knew one thing. She would never again believe that she was nothing. If this story moved you, please like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And thank you for remembering a piece of history the world nearly forgot.